Ayala Learning Knichtas.
Welcome to this series of videos in which we will explore the cultural contacts between early medieval England, Northern Africa and the Middle East.
With these videos, we hope to give you some interesting examples of intercultural contact between the East, the West in the early Middle Ages.
Chwat, we gardina in year dachum theot kuninga thrum je frunom, hu tha ethelingas ellen fremedon. If you're interested in Old English, those lines should sound familiar. They're the opening lines of the epic poem Beowulf, perhaps the most well-known text in Old English. The story of Beowulf is set in Scandinavia and features a hero from southern Sweden who travels to Denmark to rid the whole of King Hrothgar from two monsters before returning home, where he eventually dies after fighting a dragon. Intriguingly, the poem, written in early medieval England, does not take place in England, but around this area. Aside from its monsters, the poem features Danes, Swedes, Geats, Frisians, Heatherbards and Jutes, but no one from England. While this may seem curious, the other Old English texts in the Beowulf manuscript take place much further afield, in areas that we would now classify as Northern Africa, the Middle East and beyond. These texts are fascinating because they allow us to get a glimpse of how Anglo-Saxons imagined and represented these faraway places. In this video, we will introduce you to the 4 texts in the Beowulf manuscript that are not Beowulf: the Passion of St. Christopher, the Wonders of the East, the letter of Alexander the Great, and the poem Judith. If you were to go to the first folio of the Noel Codex, or the Beowulf manuscript, as it is better known, you will not find Beowulf. Instead, you will find a text called the Passion of St. Christopher, an Old English translation of a Latin text that describes the torture and death of a Christian saint called Christopher. In the Latin version of this text, St. Christopher dies in the city of Antioch, but the Old English text locates the story in a place called Samos. That brings us to this area on our map, near or in ancient Syria or present-day Turkey. Here, a cruel pagan king called Dagnus tries to convince St. Christopher to give up on Christianity in a variety of creative ways, including beating him with rods, setting fire to him, pouring hot oil all over him, pelting him full of arrows, and calling him names. "Thou wuresta wild deor, you worst wild animal." All this cruelty proved ineffective, and as a true saint, Christopher withstood it all and chose the moment of his own death, which is then followed by a number of miracles, which even make the cruel king himself convert. So far, this looks like a typical saint's life from the early Middle Ages. But there is more to this Saint Christopher. In the text, we learn that Christopher is incredibly big. And there's a good reason why King Dagnus called Christopher a wild animal. Saint Christopher was actually a giant with a dog's head, as you can see in this actual manuscript depiction of Saint Christopher from the 12th century. The depiction of the East that we get from the Passion of Saint Christopher is a bit of a mixed bag. On the one hand, it is a place where miracles do happen. On the other hand, it is a place where one might find cruel kings, and even God's saints have monstrous features. People with dogs' heads? What a strange and awkward idea. And, annoyingly, not unique to this particular text. In fact, the next 2 Old English texts in the Beowulf manuscript also imagine the East as being inhabited by dog-headed folks.
The second text within the Noel Codex is the Wonders of the East, another Old English translation of a Latin text. This prose text describes more than 30 strange creatures, monsters, humanoid, living in the area ranging from Egypt to Ethiopia, Syria and India, roughly the area shown here. The monsters being listed in the text include strange animals like giant rams, dog-sized ants, 2-headed snakes, and exploding chickens, as well as more human-like monsters such as bearded women, men without heads with faces in their chest. And, of course, people with dog heads. These creatures all come with short explanations and their nature and whereabouts, and as you will have seen, illustrations. This combination of monsters, description and images has led at least one scholar to describe the wonders of the East as an early medieval Pokédex. Indeed, it is not hard to see some similarities, though it is hard to imagine any Anglo-Saxon going to these areas to try to catch them all, since most of these creatures are described as rather unfriendly. In particular, some of these human-like monsters in the East are said to eat strangers. One example of these are the Donestre, who are said to know all human languages, which they use to trick foreigners and eat them. When they see a person of a foreign race, they name him and his kinsmen and the names of acquaintances, and with devious words they delude him, and they get hold of him, and after that they eat him, all but the head, and then sit and weep over the head. Wow, crying over the beheaded foreigners they themselves decapitated, eh? I guess these Donestre are rather bad at controlling their emotions, or should I say, keeping their heads. While all these dangerous monsters and inhospitable beings make the East sound like an unattractive place, the text does mention some redeeming qualities of the area. It is a place of great wealth. Lands are filled with treasures. There is an abundance of pepper. There are golden vineyards and jewels are growing from the trees. And some of these humanoid creatures are extremely generous, treating their guests to pearls, jewels, and even women. As we shall see, that same image of the East as a place for monstrous beings, as well as great wealth, is also found in the next text in the Beowulf Manuscript.
The letter of Alexander the Great is yet another Old English translation of a Latin text. It purports to be a letter written by the famous Greek ruler Alexander the Great to his teacher Aristotle. In the letter, Alexander describes his military expedition into India, which he undertook after defeating the Persian Empire north of Erbil, Kurdistan, Iraq. Alexander describes how his troops made an arduous journey, full of battles and dangers. These dangers include a variety of animals. He describes how they were attacked by white lions, snakes, tigers, bats, a rhinoceros, elephants, and even Micramengeo on onzeona maran und ungruwelijkan dona da elpendas, a multitude of water monsters, larger and more terrible in appearance than the elephants, which is just an interesting way of describing hippos. And those were just the animals. The locals too put up a fight, and Alexander describes how they had to fight off Michel vuurt Indische monna on vare el reordira de da land Budon, a large force of Indian men and of the gibberish-speaking people who inhabited those regions. That is not all. The harsh conditions also put a strain on Alexander and his troops. For instance, a prolonged period without drinking water, even for some of his troops, to go full Bear Grylls and drink their own urine. Somme men donna of here shome, da watan for them nude, vedon. Some men in their need consumed the liquid from their private parts.
Now, before you think that this letter is just full of harsh realism describing actual events and conditions, in this text too, the East is described in an imaginative way. For example, there is a constant emphasis on the wealth in this area. The palace of the Indian king Porus is described as having golden walls, made with golden planks as thick as fingers, with 400 golden columns, covered with golden vines, and in those vines were golden leaves and fruits made of crystals and emeralds. The chambers are decorated with gemstones and ivories, and there were many bejeweled vessels, crystals, goblets, and golden pitchers. From their efforts, Alexander and his troops naturally get very rich, and at some point they are carrying around so much gold that they resemble stars or a flash of lightning. And my entire force resembled a constellation or lightning on account of the volume of that gold. Aside from riches, the East is also described as a place where strange creatures live, including horned serpents, mice-sized foxes, talking trees, a 10 feet tall bishop of 300 years old, and of course dog-headed people. After that, we saw among the groves and the trees a large group of cynocephali, literally half dogs, which came with the intention of wounding us. Again with the dog-headed folks, we're beginning to see a pattern. The East is a marvelously strange place, full of danger, monsters and witches, completely different from the surroundings of the Anglo-Saxon monks responsible for copying this manuscript. But before you think that the Anglo-Saxon reader of the Beowulf manuscript thought of Northern Africa and the Middle East merely as a rich place teeming with monsters, it is good to know that this manuscript also contains one further text set in the East, one that does not mention monsters, let alone dog-headed ones, Judith.
The poem Judith is an Old English poetic retelling of the biblical story of Judith, the Jewish widow that saves her people by decapitating the Assyrian warlord Holofernes. The story takes place in the city of Bethulia, which may be a fictitious symbolic place or just a fancy name for Jerusalem. Which brings us around this area on our map. While the other texts we have discussed in this video depict the East as a place completely different from England, the poet of Judith made efforts to make his Eastern protagonists more similar to his Anglo-Saxon audience. For instance, the cruel Assyrian chief Holofernes is described in terms that were typically used for Germanic warlords. He is a gold friend, a giver of treasures, and at some point he even becomes Medugal, excited by mead, the drink of choice in Old English heroic poetry. Judith too is made more like the audience of the Old English poem. In the biblical story, she is a Jewish widow. But in the Old English poem, we're told that she's praying to Frumtha God, on Frovregast, Bearn al Waldom, God of origins and consoling spirit, Son of the Almighty. In other words, she is praying to the Trinity. She's no longer a Jew, but she's a Christian as the poet and audience of the Old English poem.
Finally, the East in Judith is represented as a more normal and familiar place, without excessive riches and without monsters, and yes, without dog-headed people. What's that? Should I read how the poet describes Judith decapitating Holofernes? Okay. Sluchta nos te ides elen rof othresithe thone hethenan hund that him thed heofot want forth on tha flore. The courageous lady then struck the heathen dog smartly for the second time, so that his head rolled away on the floor. Heathen dog? Surely the poet did not mean to imply...
If we look at our map of where all the texts in the Beowulf manuscript take place, none of them talk about England. And in a way, this manuscript gives us an idea of how the Anglo-Saxons imagined the world beyond their own borders. The East in particular is represented as a place of wealth and miracles, but also as an area characterized by cruelty, danger, weird beings, and monsters. Of course, it is good to realize that these stereotypical images are not based on facts, and above all, they're grossly inaccurate. Right, Fatima?
That's right! These medieval authors simply project their own fears and desires onto people living far away. All this just goes to show that creating inaccurate stereotypes of the distant other is of all ages. It is not a modern day phenomenon, it is medieval, and dare I say it, outdated. This video was made possible by Leiden University's Justice, Equity, Diversity and Inclusion Fund.